Welcome to Fishing Discoveries. You join me here on a private syndicate lake that I've been a member of since 1994, but I've not fished it in probably 8 or 10 years. It's so close to where I live that I just keep renewing the membership, saying I'll go and never get round to it. So with a nearly 10-year gap in fishing, I decided to come down yesterday and give it a try with my match tackle, which I didn't really fish match style here when I was younger. I fished it a lot for carp. Might be able to flash up a couple of shots of me in my younger years carp fishing on here. So yeah, arrived here yesterday morning and there were 2 guys fishing, and I walked up and I said, "How's it going?" "Oh, don't bother, it's rubbish, it's been rubbish all year." One guy that I was sort of chatting to, he'd had 2 perch in a couple of hours of fishing. So my expectations were rock bottom. I really sort of, had the wind taken out of my sails. I'd brought the camera with me, but I wasn't even going to bother setting the camera up. If I was going to sit here blanking, nobody really wants to watch someone sit and blank. But I decided to sort of give it my best shot anyway. I was going to fish pole as a starter. I was planning to fish a little bit of ground bait and caster. I know there's a lot of silverfish in these lakes, and that's the sort of action plan, was to come and catch silvers. It's cold weather, it's a great time to come and do it. So I'll talk you through the methods as we see a bit of fishing, but for fishing the first 4 casts, with the 4th fish being quite a nice bream, I thought, well, maybe it's worth getting the camera out. But the reason I'm sat here telling you about that now, instead of you watching me fish and talk about it, is I forgot to turn on the microphone. This one's on now today, I've double checked. So I've got a great day's fishing with no sound. So I'm going to talk you through that day's fishing now, and yeah, let's start with that bream. 4 casts in, struck into something a bit more sort of substantial. Camera wasn't rolling, but as soon as I got it in the net, I put the fish in the water in the net, got the camera set up and gave a little look to camera, chatting away, thinking I was mic'd up, but I wasn't. So yeah, that kind of, 4th fish in 4 casts, and it's a fish like that. I thought, well, maybe these guys have got it wrong. Maybe all it takes is a bit of hard work and you can catch some fish. So I think what made the difference between, let's say, any average angler, they catch a few fish and they're happy with a few fish. You can really, really up your chances if you pay serious attention to detail. And these things are not secret. There's absolutely mountains and mountains of information out on the internet. If you're willing to sort of search around, all this information's already out there. So my approach was, I was going to feed a very, very tight spot. I wasn't going to throw bait in with my hands or a catapult. I was going to use a pole pot. I used a tiny walnut-sized piece of ground bait to start with. It's a dark ground bait, and just a few pinches of casters, maybe 30 or 40 casters in the pot, not mixed in the ground bait, just separate. And I potted that out on a spot that I'd already plummeted up. When it comes to plumbing up, if you can get at the exact depth at this time of year, it can make a massive difference. I can't stress that enough, really. If you're slightly over depth, fish can be picking your bait up and dropping it and you'd never know. And if you're under depth, you may not get a fish because it's hanging there unnaturally off the bottom. In summertime, these things don't matter as much because the fish are much more active. They're kind of searching food at all levels. So if your bait's up off the bottom, a fish will have it. Might be a big shoal, all sort of frenzied, feeding all around, and they don't really notice that it's static in the water. All they know is if they don't get it, somebody else will. So summertime, you get much more aggressive takes on your float. The fish are much less discerning over whether the bait falls naturally or not. In wintertime, that's a completely different scenario. The fish can be very slow to feed and they're just picking up bait off the bottom. So you really want to get your float set at the exact depth, almost as if the hook bend is just touching the lake bed. So when it comes to plumbing up, if you plumb up and your float is actually sinking slightly and you can just see the top of the float down, you maybe an inch or two below the water, that's not good enough. You'll be an inch or two off the bottom. Conversely, if you plumb up and you can lift your float even half the body of the float out of the water, that's too deep. You want it so that you can't lift the bristle out of the water. It wants to be right on the deck and no deeper. So getting that float at the exact depth is a really, really top tip, if you like. That can make a massive difference. If the fish so much as breathes on your bait, you're going to get take straight away. You're going to get your indication straight away. That accurate baiting, putting bait on just a tiny spot, by the time it sinks down, it's going to spread out a little bit. So you're looking at maybe a big dinner plate sized area where your food's gone in. And if you can put your bait on or near that, you've got fish searching around in quite a tight area. That ground bait will basically form an area of attraction, a strong scent that brings fish in, but there's not a lot of food in that. So the few casters that go in with the pot, they'll get eaten up quite soon. So I'm kind of keeping a mental note of how many fish I've had and how many bites I've had. And if I start to feel like they've cleaned out all those casters, I'll put another pot in. That might be only once every hour, and it's only sort of 20 or 30 casters in the pot. There's an argument for feeding little and more often, but it's one of those things where you have to sort of take it on a case-by-case basis. Yesterday it worked for me, putting maybe a couple of dozen casters in every hour and maybe a little bit of ground bait in every sort of hour and a half or something like that, just to keep that smell in the water as well, that scent that brings the fish in and keeps them in that area. So my setup for the day was, I'll start with the sharp end if you like. I'd got a size 18 Preston SFL barbless hook to 0.11 hook length, and then I got 0.13 mainline, a 0.15 gram Chianti float, which I think is for number 12 or 4x12 in sort of old measurements. I got two number 12 droppers on that, spaced 6 inches apart, and I got a little bulk of the other shot to cock the float, and the float was dotted right down. Another one I can't stress enough, dot that float down as far as you can until you're struggling to see it. My eyesight's not what it was when I was a teenager fishing matches, but I'm still dotting it down as far as I can. I've maybe got 2 or 3 millimeters of bristle showing. When I was younger and my eyesight was better, it would have been like a pinhead just dimpling in the surface of the water. The lower you can shot that bristle, the more easily it goes under, so the less resistance it's offering, and that can make a huge difference to your takes. If there's any of the body showing on your float, you're way off. If your float's cocking and there's still a little bit of the shoulders on the body of the float out of the water, you're just not going to see those sort of delicate winter bites. That's quite a lot of sort of buoyancy that the fish has got to move to get an indication on that float. So dotting it down, you remove the buoyancy of the float body itself. That sort of becomes neutrally buoyant when you shot it down below the surface, and you're just working on your bristle, which has got almost no buoyancy. The slightest little knock and that bristle goes under. So yeah, dotting down that bristle helps a massive amount, and the takes can be anything from little vibrations where you see a little sort of pulse of waves come off the bristle to that bristle actually disappearing. Once or twice I got some lift bites where you can tell that the fish has lifted the bait more than 6 inches off the bottom, because it lifts that lower shot, that final dropper 6 inches from the hook, and that weight being taken off the bristle makes the bristle rise a few millimeters, and you actually see that, and you can strike and be into a fish. And another thing that happened a time or two, I was waiting for the float to fully settle. With that bulk shot, it goes down and the float cocks, and then a few seconds later you see almost like a 2-tier drop of the float as the 2 dropper shot sort of pull down on the bristle. And now and again you don't see that final sort of settling where the float's sticking up and then it goes down and down another one. It just kind of freezes. Now there's a few things that could be happening there. If you're on a varying depth bottom, your hook bait could have landed on something and the droppers are on the bottom. There could be a little twig or branch sticking up and you've got sort of, you're hanging on that and the droppers are sort of supported and not pulling down the float. But more often than not, it's the fact that a fish has taken on the drop and it's got the bait in its mouth. So those droppers are kind of suspended and not pulling on the float. So anytime your float doesn't cock in the regular kind of timing that you're used to seeing, you should strike. And I did a time or two and was greeted by another one of the silvers that I'd been catching all day. So it's really worth knowing how your float cocks normally. And that could be having a few goes of putting it in with no hook bait on. So you can get a look at that sort of rhythm of how the float cocks and then how those two droppers pull it down. Just knowing how your float behaves normally without a fish at the other end. Anything different to that at all, you should strike. Because it could be a fish. The bites are so delicate and so unpredictable at this time of year. Anything slightly out of the ordinary, give it a little lift and you could be into a fish. And if you're lucky, it might be a big fish. I suppose it's time to mention, if you're enjoying what you're watching so far, don't forget to give us a subscribe and click that notification bell. We try and put a video out every Monday, and there's often one out on a Thursday, and now and again there's something in between those as well. Hit the like button as well. That kind of thing helps other people to see these videos. When you're scrolling down YouTube and seeing all that recommended stuff, the more likes, the more subscriptions we get, the more that gets recommended to other anglers. So help us out, guys. Click like, subscribe, and that's enough of that. Let's get back to the fishing. After a top up of ground bait, after that first sort of hour and a half of fishing, I hooked up into something a little bit more substantial. Got that elastic sort of pulling out, and I got back to the top two sections and just tightened up the elastic a bit, thinking, way, we're into another big fish, and bang, rig comes shooting out the water and the fish has shed the hook. So I'm guessing it was a bream. It felt like the first one. It's that typical sort of heavy feeling on the end of the line, but not much of a fight. So a bit disappointing to lose a bigger fish. It would have been nice to have a couple of fish like that in the net at the end of the session. But got straight back out there and carried on catching the sort of regular size roach that I'd been catching through the session. My pole setup, it's a Maver Signature 800 pole, 16 metre pole. There's no need, for the sort of fishing you see me doing on this video, there's no need for a big expensive pole like that. I was fishing top two sections plus 3 other sections, so that's 3, 4.5, 5, it's about 7 metres I think. So not a long sort of reach at all. And there are plenty of poles on the market that will reach 7 metres for not a lot of money at all. So if you've not given pole fishing a go and you want to try, don't be put off by thinking you need to be fishing at sort of 14.5 and 16 metres. That's quite specialist stuff, and it gets really expensive to fish those long lengths. And you don't need it if you're just pleasure fishing from the margins out to sort of 8 or 9 metres. There's plenty of sport to be had. In the top sections, I'd got a number 4 to 6 elastic. That's a hollow elastic where the rating changes depending on how tight it is. And these sort of modern elastics where you can use the puller kits where you can tension the elastic from the back of the top 2 sections by pulling elastic through the pole. It allows you to sort of ramp up the tension in the elastic, so if you get a bigger fish you can put more strain on the fish. But if you're hooking lots of small fish, you've got a soft elastic that keeps the tension on with those small fish and you don't bump the fish off. All too often with small fish, if you've got too heavy a rod action or too heavy an elastic in a pole, you can let these little fish bump off barbless hooks because they're so small, there's almost no pressure on the hook. And a soft elastic just helps sort of cushion that sort of jiggling around of a small fish and keep the hook in the fish's mouth. So a 4 to 6 was plenty for the sort of fishing I was doing. If I'd have hooked into something bigger than the bream I had, just pulling a few feet of elastic out the back of the pole would have tensioned it up and given me a bit stronger elastic in the fight. One thing I noticed from the off, I was kind of looking towards the sun. These winter days, you've got low sun in the sky. At some point, if you're facing towards the sun or towards where the arc of the sun's going to be, you're going to be looking straight into the sun or straight into the reflection of the sun off the water. So I deliberately fished off to one side, the furthest away from where the sun was going to track, so that I'd got the maximum amount of time possible before the sun kind of spoiled my fun and was in my eyes. So I was fishing right over to the right-hand side of my spot, with the game plan of changing late on in the day when the sun reached that spot. So I plumbed off to the opposite side, the furthest side away to the left, at the same distance at the start of the session, just to make sure that there was something sort of practical to fish there as well. And I was sort of aware as the sun was approaching and visibility was getting more difficult towards the end of the session, I was going to put out a couple of ground bait and some casters onto a new spot that I'd already checked the depth of. It was about 3 inches deeper than where I was fishing. So when it got round to that last hour, let's say, the sun had moved across the sky. It was right in my eyes on the spot I'd been fishing all day, so I knew I had to have a change. So about 10 minutes before, I preempted that with a pot of walnut-sized bit of ground bait and a few casters onto the new spot I'd got in mind. But before I did that, I just ran out my plummet on the end of the rig and just double-checked the depth. Got it absolutely spot on. Brought my line in then, put some bait out there, and then gave it a few minutes before actually fishing on it. I could have carried on catching fish on the spot where I'd been fishing all day, if I could see, but I couldn't see. So what are you going to do? Feel for a bite, wait till they start pulling elastic out the end of the pole? You know, I'm going to miss more fish than I'd catch fishing blind in, straight into the sun. So I'd got to take that chance of fishing a new spot. As it turns out, it paid off, and there was a complete change of the species of fish I was catching. Apart from the big bream at the very start of the session, I'd been catching little roach all day. And as soon as I moved to this new spot, within a couple of casts in, I had a bite, and it was a skimmer, little tiny skimmer, only a few inches long. And it seemed like every fish after that was a skimmer. I did have a couple of roach, I think, off that spot, but it was all skimmers. And another thing I noticed, I was bumping a lot more fish on that spot. So I have to theorise that maybe the skimmers take your bait slightly different to the way the roach were taking it, because every roach was up perfectly in the lip. I could get the hook out without a disgorger, and oftentimes the caster was still on the hook. But the skimmers, they were very difficult bites to hit, and I bumped several fish. But I still made a good account of myself in the last hour. I had a few skimmers, a couple of slightly bigger ones than the roach I've been catching. But all in all, that last hour switch of strategy paid off. It kind of makes you wonder if you'd have been better on that spot all day, but certainly the first half of the day, I'd been faced with the same scenario as the end of the day on my other spot. I'd have been fishing straight into the sun, and it wouldn't have been practical. So that's one thing you've got to bear in mind. If you arrive at a spot where you're going to fish with a float, and it's a winter's day and you're facing towards the sun or the arc of the sun, just bear in mind that sun's probably going to spoil your fun at some point. So you may want to fish the furthest spot away from where that sun's going to be to give yourself the maximum time, and maybe pre-bait a spot where the sun is now, so you can go there after the sun's moved and spoiled your fun. What more can I say? I had a cracking session, just totaling up in the bottom of the net after pulling the keep net out. I reckon about 40 fish, maybe a few over. That one nice bream. I lost a nice bream in the middle of the session as well. That gave me a typical bream fight. Hooked something, felt heavy, but didn't really fight. Pulled a bit of elastic out, but as I got down to the top sections, we're just tightening up the elastic, and pop, off comes the bream. But yeah, a nice net of silvers for what was basically a 3-hour session. I arrived here quite late, was fishing by midday, and was packing up by 3 o'clock. So yeah, short session, 40 odd fish. Just that attention to detail got me a net full of fish on a lake where people have been complaining that, the sport's not been great, people have not been catching, it's been rubbish all year. I'm certainly going to be back and see if I can do a repeat of yesterday's action. Maybe I'll report on that too. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, don't forget to like and subscribe and click that notification bell so that you hear when more of these videos come out. That's it for me for now, but join us next time on Fishing Discoveries. We try and get one of these out every Monday, and often there's a bonus video on a Thursday as well. So click the subscribe and you'll get told about that. I'll see you next time on the next episode of Fishing Discoveries.